Hello there, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So thanks to everyone for coming tonight. My name is Avery Brooks, and I'll introduce myself in a minute, but this is through the Western Colorado Writers Forum. And so I want to thank them for hosting this talk as part of their Writers Night, their monthly Writers Night. And I want to explain that when I was invited to give a talk a few months ago, we weren't really sure where we'd be with the pandemic and everything. And so I opted for a Zoom, which is kind of cool because, I get to talk to people locally here in Western Colorado in Grand Junction, but also reaching people in other places. And since today is June 1st, happy Pride Month, everybody. I feel really honored to be able to give a talk about queer characters and storylines to kind of kick the month off. So thank you all for being here and taking time. I know it's the day after the Memorial Day holiday, so I'm sure today was a struggle to return to normal life. So a few kind of technical things. I'm used to doing Zoom meetings, but this is a Zoom webinar. And so my understanding is that there's a few differences that will be important. So I'm going to switch over to PowerPoint in a few minutes, and my understanding is that my video will go away. At least that's what I'm hoping for, so y'all aren't just staring at me the whole time. And I'll be looking at the Q&A for interaction with you all, so hopefully that will work out, but just a little patience if you don't mind as we kind of work through those things. And I'm going to be going through probably just over an hour of content with the talk, and then I'll open up for questions. I'm used to doing more interactive talks and teaching university students. So kind of just talking to a silent void is, well, it's also like when I taught university students, but just me laughing at my own jokes, but nonetheless. And I will mention that I have 2 dogs in the background, which is why I'm in a back room with like no decorations. They've been napping all day in preparation to bark. So if all of a sudden you hear dogs barking and I go on mute, just give me a second and I'll take care of those and hop back on. So let's see, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. So as I said, my name is Avery Brooks. I'm a published author of LGBTQ+ fiction or queer fiction. And if you don't know fully those terms, then this is the talk for you. And my kind of background is more in lesbian fiction, focusing on what we call WLW or women-loving women literature. So I'll explain all that in a few minutes. My debut novel is called OtherGirls, and we'll be talking about kind of otherness in terms of the queer community a bit today. And my background is more that I have a PhD in evolutionary biology. So I'm used to teaching university students, as I said, at multiple universities, and typically biology classes, though I have taught or co-taught classes on LGBT studies and related topics at the university level. So, I'll kind of draw on that today. And then in case it matters to those of you who are local, I've lived here in Grand Junction for over 10 years. And there haven't been a lot of opportunities that I've noticed to have talks like this one. So I want to thank the Western Colorado Writers Forum for, supporting this talk, asking me to give it, and kind of opening that door for a little bit more representation and diversity and inclusion here locally, which, we drastically need. So thank you for that. So what I'm going to try to do, we'll see, is to switch over to PowerPoint here. So give me a second. Okay. Okay, it looks like I can see the Q&A box, so that will be important in a few minutes if y'all want to interact. So there's probably a mix of different people kind of attending tonight, and this is also being recorded. So, you know, it will be put up on the westerncoloradowriters.org site. And I am a little bit wordy because of that, so people can go back and look at stuff. And also if someone is audio impaired, then they can read some of the words. So if you miss something I say, or there's a link you didn't quite catch, at the end of the talk, I have my email. I'll also be doing Q&A at that point. But you can also go back to the PowerPoint and look at it. So like I said, there's probably a mixture of different people here. And so I wanted to hopefully reach everybody to some extent. So if you're not familiar with kind of the LGBT community or all those terms, but you want to learn more and or write a character, then this is really kind of what this talk is about, engaged for you. So we'll be getting into some terminology, not a ton, but enough for you to understand what LGBTQ plus refers to, different literature types, and really the important kind of basics for building a strong, well-developed and multi-dimensional character who is part of the queer community, if that's what you're wanting to do. If you're someone who's more familiar with these terms and where you have written queer characters, I'm still going to provide some resources and tips that should be useful to you all. And if you're a well-seasoned queer author, then you can listen to my take on the landscape and see if you agree or not. And, you know, that'll be interesting. Okay, so I guess you can tell I was a teacher, but anyway, the outline for tonight is we'll go through some terminology. I'll talk a bit about writing strong characters, and then specifically, you know, for queer characters. We'll go through queer storylines, some unique aspects for queer characters. I'll talk about some tips and kind of ways for you to do further research on your own, and then some cool resources and upcoming events even later this week and in the coming months. So if you can't stay through all of it, like I said, I'll probably go for about an hour and then do Q&A. There is some kind of cool local stuff that you'll be hearing about, so you can check back about that. So in terms of terminology, this is a writer's focused kind of venue, but whether or not you're an aspiring writer or just someone who appreciates reading, terminology is really interesting, and it's an ever evolving and dynamic system. Not only do we kind of determine the words that go in the dictionary, but by our actions and words and cultural changes and things like that, but the words in the dictionary impact us as well. And so it's this kind of dynamic feedback loop, if you want to think about it that way, which is really pretty cool. And one really important thing about this talk and about language in particular is that, language is subjective. So I'm approaching what most people would call middle age. And so depending on who I'm talking to, I'm either young or old, or maybe both at the same time, I don't know. But in my heart, I'm an 80-year-old man who's like a hermit and doesn't like kids walking on my front lawns when my dogs are barking at them. I tell my dogs to stop, but secretly I'm proud. So that's my view, okay, is, middle age or older when I talk about different terms in the queer community. So the term queer for me was a slur growing up. So people my age and older would understand that. And younger generations, have reclaimed it, and that's a great thing. And so I'll talk about queer literature, I'll talk about being a queer writer, and that's fine. But when I talk about myself as being queer, it's something that still has a little bit of a knife's edge to it, just personally identifying as that. And that's just from still coming out of it being used as a negative term. So, how we respond to language is going to be a very subjective experience. And so keep that in mind, particularly for character development. And also context is important. So, when I was in college, this one woman said, if I say I am a dyke, that was a term she used to describe herself. That's very different from some guy hanging out of a truck screaming, "You're a dyke." And so keep that in mind, that the same word can be filled with power or negative connotation, depending on the context. So in terms of the terminology I'm going to go over, the next slide will be quite a few definitions just so you understand LGBTQ plus. And so I wanted to put some resources here, and Google is your friend here, but always vet your resources. So make sure it's a queer friendly site. The Human Rights Campaign's glossary of terms is pretty good. It's HRC is very supportive advocacy of the queer community. It's a bit of a shorter glossary if you look at it, but it is supportive. UC Davis's LGBTQIA Resource Center glossary was a bit extensive, and I thought it was fine. So those are just two I pulled for you guys. And so the other thing that was really cool, I was just wandering in the library the other day, as I'm sure many of you tend to do. And I came across this book that just came out in 2021 called The Queen's English, the LGBTQIA plus dictionary. And it has over 800 terms in it. I'm enjoying it a lot. I have it right here next to me. And it really not only talks about terms and defines them and also colloquial terms, but it gives a history of words that might have been used as slurs and that are now being reclaimed. So I would recommend this book to anyone because it's really, really interesting. Okay. So there's three kind of major terms you'll want to know, and this is really important for kind of character development if you're writing a queer character and or to relate to someone who does identify as queer. And this has been made by the Trans Student Educational Resources. So if you go to transstudent.org/gender, they have this image along with a lot more information there. So I'll give you the three definitions on the left that correspond to the images on the right, but gender identity is how someone understands their own gender and or self. So, it's an internal understanding with your own self about being, whether you feel like you're male, female, in some cases, neither or both or another gender. And this will be important for you to understand when we get to the next slide with more definitions. So whether you feel male or female, things like that, that's what gender identity is. Gender expression is going to be pretty important as well when you write characters who are queer, because this is the outward characteristics. This is how they, queer people, express their gender identity to the rest of the world. So your appearance, your behaviors, your attitudes, anything that is expressing how you feel as male or female, etc. That's going to be really important. And then sexual orientation, that can be sexual, it can be emotional or romantic attraction that a person has toward others. So again, we'll get to some different definitions on the next page. And so someone might be emotionally attracted to one gender, physically attracted to another. And so it can get pretty complex, and that's where you want to really understand the characters you're writing and or reading. Okay, so this looks like a lot of words because it is, but basically I'm just giving the definitions of what LGBTQ plus means. And many of these you might know or you think you know, but we'll go through them nonetheless. So, this talk is about LGBTQ plus characters and storylines, and an interchangeable word for that is queer. So I'll go back and forth between those today, and I'll explain why on this slide. But when you say LGBTQ plus, the plus is the QIAP, so up at the top there. So like I just said, queer and LGBTQ plus is an umbrella term to include pretty much anyone that doesn't identify as heterosexual and the gender binary of male or female. So there's a kind of fancy word saying heteronormative are those who identify as heterosexual. It's the idea that that's the default or kind of normal, and that there's a gender binary of male and female. So if you're non-heteronormative, that means you don't identify as heterosexual and within the gender binary. And so if you don't, then you're queer. Okay. So lesbian, many people, I think, know that term. After many years of friendship with an older guy, I found out he thought lesbian, he didn't realize it was specific to women. And that was one of the most surprising days of my life. So I had put in a lot of time with education with that relationship. Okay, so I identify as a lesbian. This is a woman who is sexually or romantically attracted to other women. Um, and, you know, a lot of the younger generations might not like that word. It's, you know, a bit formal. It's not very sexy, but I'm fine with it. I like it. I'm reclaiming it. Gay, so that's a term many people have heard. And this is actually a more general term. So it's a person who is sexually or romantically attracted to members of the same gender. It doesn't necessarily mean male relationships. So I'll talk about gay fiction pretty soon, which is a bit more specific to male relationships. But I tell people that I'm gay and a lesbian. Gay is just a more general term. Lesbian is specific to women. Bisexual is a person who is sexually or romantically attracted to more than one gender. Transgender, so that's what the T stands for, is a person who identifies with a gender identity. Remember, that was male, female, or other, and or gender expression that differs from what they were assigned at birth. So if someone was born female at birth based on their sex and the expectations from that sex, and then they decide that their gender identity is male, that would be transgender, okay? And one thing to point out is that it doesn't necessarily imply a specific sexual orientation. So you can be straight, gay, lesbian, etc., and be transgender. And that's a bit more complicated, but just to keep that in mind. So the Q stands for queer. Like I said, that's an umbrella term. It's a lot easier to say than LGBTQ+. So like I said, I'll be going back and forth between the two. And it's basically just an inclusive term of everyone in this group. And I did want to mention the word cisgender here. So if you ever hear cis and gender or transgender, we just talked about what transgender is. Cisgender or cis is a person whose gender identity matches their gender or sex that they were assigned at birth. So for example, you know, I was a female at birth. I was expected to be female-ish in my behaviors. I still identify as a female, so I'm cisgender. So I would be a cisgender lesbian, for example. Intersex, you know, this used to be the term was hermaphrodite. We don't use that with humans anymore, but you do with other kind of like plants and things like that, and other non-human animals. So intersex is someone who's born with variations on sex characteristics that would usually, you know, put someone as a male or female. So you have genital ambiguity. It might be at the chromosomal level where you never actually see any physical manifestation of that. And so those would be intersex individuals, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Asexual is a person who doesn't experience sexual attraction or desire to other people. And so if you're interested in that, there's a really great contemporary romance I would recommend that kind of flips everything on its head in terms of what you expect from characters when in a romance when one doesn't actually experience sexual attraction. And then pansexual is the P. So that's a person who is sexually or romantically attracted to people of all genders and sexualities. Pan means all. And so some people lump bisexuals and pansexuals together, but others do not. So it's a lot of different terms, but hopefully, you know, you can go back to this and digest it. Some of these, you know, you might be completely familiar with this, and this was a big yawn. And, you know, but there's a lot of different people being represented here, so it's important to get it right. Okay, so just like there are different terms for different gender identities and gender expressions, there's also some differences in terms for queer literature. So queer literature, again, would be the umbrella term, including all literature about all the different groups we just mentioned. So gay fiction, even though gay can mean females as well, in literature and gay fiction is typically meant to refer to gay males. So I'll mention publishers at the end of the talk that have both lesbian fiction and gay fiction. And so they usually separate those out. With lesbian fiction, or, you know, lesfic is a hashtag on Twitter if you're interested in that. You know, that's what I write, and that's gone through an evolution in and of itself. So it used to be lesbian fiction, but even though we called it lesfic, you know, there were bisexual authors, there were trans women and things like that. So it's moved to be what we call WLW literature, which means women loving women literature. And that's a more inclusive term, also of what a woman is, right? And there are men who write women loving women literature. And the main point is that the two main characters are women. And then one last term is sapphic fiction or sapphic romance, and that, you know, derives from the Greek poet Sappho on the island of Lesbos, and that's related to lesbianism. That one hasn't caught on that I know as much. I think maybe some of the younger generations use it. So I might say lesbian fiction referring to what I write, or WLW, depending on how much breath I have or how many syllables I feel like going for. But the take home message is that, you know, language is constantly in flux. It's constantly evolving, which is awesome. But what matters is really trying to aim for inclusivity and representing all the diversity that actually exists out there. And it's good to be interested. I think whenever you're asking someone or trying to, you know, find out more information, tone matters a lot. People can tell intent. So, you know, as long as you have the right intent, you'll go a long way in like learning without trying to offend people versus someone who's coming in and trying to be offensive about it or putting people down with these terms. Okay. And I'm trying to see how I can actually see. All right, there we go. All right. So this is kind of like my take on interactivity. It's the only question I'll have for you, so don't worry if that kind of stuff freaks you out. But kind of switching from the terminology side to what makes a strong character, and we'll get into character development. I want y'all to take a minute and think of a strong character and or storyline that has stayed with you long after you finish the book. And if you can, what was it that made that character or story stand out to you? And I'll give you a minute. If you feel like sharing, go ahead and put it in the Q&A box if you can, and we'll move forward that way. Okay. I'll give you a few more seconds to think about that, and or not seeing anyone typing anything in, so. Okay. Okay, so I'm not sure if y'all can see the Q&A or if only I can, so I'll just read this out. So thank you to one of the people who answered. So I think if a character drives the plot, then that character is a strong character. Okay, let's see. Any other comments? You can put them in the Q&A box. This is kind of like when, just like university students, where you learn to hold out longer and then it just gets too uncomfortable and people answer. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and leave it at that. Thank you to the person responding. And I did actually ask this question to some fellow writer friends of mine who write lesbian fiction. And this is what they had to say. So a bunch of us actually thought of the book Curious Wine. And this is written by the icon in lesbian fiction, Catherine Forrest. It was published back in 1983, so it's a classic for many people. It was their first book that was lesbian fiction. And when I asked kind of what was it that stood out for them and myself, one character is out as being gay, as a lesbian, and the other is not. And so a lot of it is kind of the yearning and the discovery of one's own sexuality and that budding romance. it's really kind of a slow burn in an exceptional way. They quote Emily Dickinson to each other, which one of my friends really enjoyed. So those of you who are more romantic or enjoy poetry might find that interesting. And another person liked that the fact that the time period was when they grew up. So there was some nostalgia and relating to the way the world was at that time. Another book is Am Playing the Role of Herself by K.E. Lane. If you asked a bunch of lesfic writers one of their favorite books and or one of the best books in WLW literature, many of them would say And Playing the Role of Herself. It's on the top list for many different authors who are award winners themselves. It's written in the first person just from one of the female characters' points of view, and yet the two characters are incredibly well developed, and the love story between them is really captivating. They're both actresses, and one is gay, but she's an A-list celebrity, so she's not out. And then the other one has just realized she's gay as well, but hasn't been with a woman before. And like I said, they're both captivating characters and they stay with you for a long time. Another friend recommended Middlesex, or that was the story that came out for them. And that's a multi-generational story about an intersex man. So coming to terms with, or coming of age story through that. And so it deals with gender identity, gender expression, kind of nature nurture debate, which I would roll my eyes if I was actually teaching biology, because well, it's a biology nerd thing. But anyway, and so that one's a really interesting one as well, won the Pulitzer Prize. And then the other one was The Miseducation of Cameron Post, which is a YA novel. Someone who would never be caught dead outside of New York City said it made them want to visit Montana. So that one had a vivid setting. And this one, it's, a teen girl who is coming out, but she's pretty confident in her sexuality, but her family sends her to conversion therapy camp to be not gay. And so it's a really interesting kind of difference on the coming out journey. So if I were to take all these things and say, what makes a strong character and or story, I think there's a few things that stuck out to me from my friends' answers. One is nostalgia of time period or place, some place you've been yourself or grew up in. Along that idea is the vivid setting. So someone who writes a setting beautifully, it kind of becomes another character in the book. But basically some aspect of the character's journey that resonates with the reader. And in the case of queer characters, that will often be discovery of oneself and gender identity and sexual orientation, gender expression. So you can either directly relate and resonate with aspects that you've experienced yourself, or you read something that's just such a well-developed character and story that's so captivating that you feel something even if you haven't experienced it yourself. And I think, that's our job as writers, no matter what the topic is. If we can get down to the base human experience, it doesn't matter the sexuality of the individual. Everyone knows what rejection feels like. Everyone knows what a first love feels like. Maybe discovery of your own sexuality, that is a little bit more specific to the queer community, to the extent that, we go through that identity process. But I think if you write a well-developed character, it will propel the story and stay with people long after. Okay, so if we talk about character development, and I'm sure you all know these tips, but I'll just go through general character development tips, and then I'll bring in how to add some components that would be specific to queer characters. So, the goal, like I just said, is you want to create a multidimensional character that has depth, that really makes the reader identify with that character, that makes them feel, right? And that will stay with them. Everything else might go away. So a few tips here, if you give your character a strong goal and motivation, and this can be quite complex. So, giving them multiple lines, but what they want and why they want it. providing external and internal conflicts for your character. So specific to the queer community, being bullied is something that many of us have experienced. That's an external conflict. Of course, it has internal ramifications. But coming to terms with your sexuality is an internal conflict that will come up, if not in your story itself, then in the backstory of your character. So, and the more external and internal conflicts you add in there, just the more complicated and complex and beautiful I think that character and storyline will be. Another important thing is giving your character strengths, but also weaknesses, and then quirks and unique traits that make them not just some superficial individual. So I remember Dorothy Allison, who wrote Bastard Out of Carolina, was giving a talk, and she said something to the effect of, don't tell me your character's upset. Describe them dragging their nails through their skin because they can't take it anymore. And that stays with you. You feel that, you relate to that. So again, that's showing versus telling, like we all know. But yeah, and when we're talking about gender expression, that will come up through quirks and unique traits of your characters as well. Don't make your character perfect, because no one likes perfect people anyway. But and then this will be really important for queer characters, but you should know your character's backstory. So whether you actually write about it in your book or story or not, knowing where they came from will tell you how they're going to react to things. Knowing someone comes from abuse and has anxiety issues will impact every interaction they have, regardless of whether you talk about that history or not. So that's going to be really important, and particularly the coming out journey, as I'll talk about more with queer characters, is going to be essential and crucial in the backstory. And then lastly, you want to distinguish your characters in terms of physical characteristics and dialogue. Dialogue is a little harder, but it's still important, even if only differentiating it a little bit. So particularly when you're writing about two people who are the same sex, two 30-year-old brunette women with hazel eyes as the main characters might get pretty dull. So you want to kind of change that up. I was actually, told to make sure, even in my book where I didn't do this, be careful about having characters with names that start with the same letter. So I have an Ash and an Allie, and even though one's just a secondary character, you want to make the character stand out to your reader, so there's no reason they should get confused. In dialogue, you can have a fast talker with anxiety. You can have someone who's more educated using, more complex words, but not always. An accent, an affectation, things like that. It gets back to age and generation as well. What terms do they use to, for themselves? Okay. So I was looking for some inspiration for y'all. And so here's a couple of quotes. Plot is what keeps you going when you read a story. Character is what stays with you. And then the second quote is by Rita Mae Brown, who's an icon in lesbian literature. And so I thought this would be important. Character is destiny. Change, growing from within and forced from without, is the mainspring of character development. So hopefully that makes you inspired to go write some awesome characters. So, okay, that's the general stuff that you can see everywhere about character development, what everyone tells you to do. But what are some aspects that are important for queer characters? Sorry, just drinking some water. So gender identity and pronouns will be really important. So if someone identifies as male, then using he or they, things like that. So pronouns would be he, she, they. A lesbian character, actually the Queen's English, the dictionary I mentioned earlier, has some great diagrams about this, but we go from femme to butch in terms of feminine to masculine. So a femme romance would be to more female identified women. A butch femme kind of book would be a woman who presents more with masculine traits, like shorter hair, maybe in the way they walk, things like that, with a more feminine, female identified character. And so, actually the femme romances are kind of the major ones that sell a lot within lesfic, and I'll talk more about that later, but these are important things to think about in terms of presentation and stuff. Gender expression will be huge again with a character you write. So looking at someone's clothes, the way they walk. If it's someone where they're a trans character and they're not accepting of the body they were born in, so where are they on that journey of transition? You know, are they using bindings to transform their body and clothing and things like that until they can get a surgery that makes them feel the way they feel internally? And those are really sensitive topics, and getting them right is essential if you write a trans character. If you look at these pictures, the top one is Gentleman Jack, that TV series, which is a historical based on true story. And you'll notice that the character on the left, you know, they're wearing a skirt and things like that and corsets, but they have a tie, all in black, a top hat. When you watch the way they walk in the show, and also just societal, you know, bucking societal norms and things like that, that's a clear kind of change to what would be expected at that time, as is the woman next to her. Okay, let's see, dialogue and terminology. I already kind of talked about this a little bit, but you know, if you have a grandmother talking to a grandchild who's in their teens, a grandmother will have a different reaction to the word queer than someone who's younger and who that word is a word of power. So kind of having that stuff show up in dialogue and terminology. So hidden touches is a big one. You know, we as queer people live in the margins. And to me, this is really one of the hallmarks of life as a queer person. So I'll try to explain this. So, you know, if you watch Gentleman Jack, or the movie underneath it is Ammonite with Kate Winslet. And I will say I'm a Kate Winslet fan, and I have watched some slow movies, but in this one, like the wind is like a primary character. So if you're not a fan of slow movies, maybe don't watch Ammonite, but it's still, you know, a beautiful story. But in both of those situations, you have the characters kind of brushing up against each other, holding hands secretly. You know, it's these things that when you live in a straight dominant kind of society, where you could be, you know, receive violence or worse for being queer, you know, these hidden touches are the little bits of intimacy that are being able to be shared with other queer people. And so I think that's really important. And I don't know, people outside the queer community might not notice that as much, but it's pretty huge. The other thing is, you know, is this a coming out story or are they already out? And I think that will be a pivotal point when I talk about storylines, is the character's own like internal journey as to whether they've accepted themselves and come out or not. And if they are out, you know, what is their backstory? So what is their coming out story? Were they kicked out of their home? Were they disowned? Have they reformed bonds with their family and things like that? Those are huge issues, you know, within the queer community. And it brings me to the next point, which is, you know, for people who have been disowned or kicked out or lost their families for being queer, you know, there's this idea of chosen family. And it's the people that we view as our family members when our biological families turn their backs on us, you know. And one book I would really recommend is by a multi-award winning queer author, Anna Burke. She's known for a lot of things, but one thing she does really well too is she rewrites fairy tales from a queer perspective. So she wrote the story of Robin Hood in the book Nottingham, and it has this cast of diverse queer characters. It's really awesome. And she's a beautiful lyrical writer as well. And she really deals with the issue of chosen family and outing another individual, which is a huge issue, especially for outing trans people. It can be a life or death issue. It's a real safety issue. And she does those kind of brilliantly in a in a way that only people who kind of know these are actual major issues would even pick up on it. There's not an alert that says, hey, here's a life lesson. You know, it's just brilliantly woven into the story. The other book I'll recommend about this is Being Emily by Rachel Gold. This is a YA book about a trans girl from their perspective of, you know, coming out as trans. And Rachel Gold has really made a name for themselves in terms of YA stories of trans characters. So that will be, you know, a good one to look into if you're interested. Okay. So that's kind of the bit about characters, and now is the piece about how do we put queer characters into, you know, storylines, and what is different really about a queer storyline from everything else. And I really kind of in my mind was thinking about whether you've come out or if you're still struggling with coming out, is this major kind of differentiation in terms of the major conflicts that queer characters kind of deal with. And when I asked my author friends about, you know, their favorite book or a book that stayed with them, my friend JC actually used these terms that really kind of clarified what I was trying to say. So thanks, JC. These are your words. So there's kind of two main camps if you think about queer storylines. One is those who are struggling with their identity, and the other is those who have come out and or accepted their identity. So it's not about coming out anymore. It's about, you know, everything after being gay. And so if you look at these two different types of characters, the interaction between the two is a brilliant kind of conflict right there to write about. And so that's what happened in Curious Wine. There was the woman who was straight and attracted to a woman. So she hadn't come out. She didn't know she was gay. And then a character who was gay. And playing the role of herself, there was the character who had just come out, so still kind of struggling with their identity, and the one who knew she was gay but hiding it kind of because she's an A-list celebrity, so having, you know, a beard basically to date that was a man. So these are kind of two major pieces. And if we expand on that, then I'd like to kind of present a continuum. These are my own ideas, so you can only blame me for them. But it makes sense to me in terms of how we look at queer storylines. So we have the coming out stories, the coming out journey. Then we have the thing I just talked about, that interplay between one character who's out and one who is not. So someone who's still struggling with their identity. And then on the other end of the continuum are where the main characters are out or they accept their identity. And so while there's still conflicts that they're going to experience, the focus is not on coming out per se. And these aren't, you know, mutually exclusive categories. The lines are blurred, but I try to put some books that align mostly with these different areas. So I'll go through those. But one thing I do want to point out is that with all of these, you know, the characters are typically still experiencing some external conflict because of their gender identity and or sexual orientation. So even books where the main characters are out, they accept themselves as queer, they're cool with it, they're loving their lives, you know, you still have conflict from families, towns, jobs, the motivations of other characters, you know, for more historical books or books, you know, like James Baldwin's and Sarah Waters, I'll talk about in a minute. Whereas maybe in the 60s and 70s, you also have kind of societal and cultural views of what is moral and what is legal and things like that. And while we still have those pressures, you know, it's not as bad for the queer community, you know, though we still have a long way to go. So it's not that great either. All right, so coming out stories, some examples here. Being Emily, I mentioned, and the Miseducation of Cameron Post. Another one is Jeanette Winterson's Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. And again, a coming of age story of a queer person. This one deals with religion and a Pentecostal church and things like that. With the interplay between one character who's out and one who's either not or struggling with their identity and still coming to terms there. We've been over Curious Wine. Another one would be Sarah Waters' Tipping the Velvet. And then James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. And one thing that was really interesting about James Baldwin's Giovanni's room is he said that, let me see, I wrote this down so I would get it right. It's not about homosexuality, it's the vehicle through which the book moves. It's about what happens to you if you're afraid to love anybody. And so the point, is that when you get down to the universal kind of truth you're trying to express, the more the vehicle it's in, whether it's, a queer character or a straight character, shouldn't matter as much because the universal truth comes through. Okay, and then the main characters part, you might have seen this on, I think it was Netflix, but Tales of the City. And while there are issues of coming out in that it's a myriad of different characters, there's a lot of, once the people have already come out and what that life looks like. And then the other thing I'll mention is, contemporary romances. My background's more in the lesbic category. So Georgia Beers is one of the major writers there, where both of the main characters are gay. They might not know if each other's gay, but for the most part, these people have already come out. And so you can celebrate more of the traditional love story and not having to go through the whole coming out story, though it might be important in some books. And Melissa Braden is another kind of top author in that genre. And she's really kind of made a name for herself in writing series where it's a group of females who identify as queer. And so you just see, these queer characters being supportive of one another. And it's kind of like this idealized world where you're not seeing, as much external conflict for people being gay or that coming out journey that, can be a bit more upsetting. Okay. And like I said, these categories can blend together, and I couldn't give a talk about queer fiction without, mentioning Rita Mae Brown. She was the one who I quoted earlier. Ruby Fruit Jungle was the first lesbic book I ever read. And, like Curious Wine is the first for many, Ruby Fruit Jungle is the first for many others. And her book, Ruby Fruit Jungle, kind of goes across all these categories. It follows this one main character from childhood, coming to terms with their sexuality, going through different relationships with men and women, and then reaching a point where they're very outspoken about really being into women. So, that's another one I would kind of recommend, but it just shows that, this is all kind of a continuum. Let me just check here. Okay, so there's interesting questions. So it says, I don't know if I had the right material, but almost every lesbian storyline, books, movies, TV shows I've come across doesn't have happy endings. Is this something you find as well? No. I'm sure there are, but what I write is, contemporary romance, and like Georgia Beers, Melissa Braden I just mentioned, those are contemporary romance. And so a romance by definition has to have a happily ever after. So, if that's what you're looking for, definitely make sure you're looking in the romance category. But yeah, I'll talk about that in a bit more in a few minutes. There is a whole bury the gays trope that's come about in the mainstream. So keep that burning for a minute and I'll come back to that. That is a really good point. But you can find happy endings for queer people. So I do want to make that point because we deserve them. Okay, so a few last points about the queer storylines. So major themes that I've seen in the past, and this is particularly the case with women loving women fiction or lesbian fiction, if you want to think about it that way, is that the very attractive, very fit, and or very wealthy characters, typically kind of on the younger end, 20s and 30s, and typically the femme-femme relationships I mentioned, those are the best sellers. Those do really well. So for example, you have two attractive female identifying, lipstick lesbian kind of femme women in their 30s finding love. And it's kind of interesting because we've had discussions with other authors. I'm giving you guys kind of the bird's eye view of some, the big picture, but for sure, everything I'm presenting today, we, in the queer community and the lesbian community, we have long discussions about this, and I'll mention that with upcoming events in case you want to listen to them, because these are not easy issues. But one thing that's come up in my mind as to why we have these ultra successful, ultra beautiful, ultra fit, sexy, icons as our main characters is maybe an aspect of kind of, because we're a marginalized community, giving power to our community through the stories and the roles that represent us. So, it is an escape from reality where we might fear for our lives, fear for our safety by being visible and being gay, whether it's holding your partner's hand in public or, just saying that you're gay or having a sticker on the back of your car, that promotes equality. And I don't think that's specific to a marginalized community. I think there's a point in maybe it's 30, especially with women, where you go for escaping reality and looking for romance and things like that, but that's a whole other topic. And I do want to point out that there have been more diverse themes within lesbic and queer fiction and things like that, but the things I just delineated here at the top tend to sell the best. And it's really interesting because it's a whole nother issue, but we have queer readers saying they want more representation, they want more diversity, and yet they don't buy the books we write that have those aspects in them. And so there's a real issue of using your dollars as voting, to vote. So some themes now, and by now I just mean the past few years, we are seeing more diversity in terms of queer storylines. So different body shapes and sizes, different ages, more tough issues. So trauma, mental health, bullying's a big one, otherness in terms of maybe different physical abilities. When I wrote my book, OtherGirls, you might understand now that term has dual meaning in terms of otherness of the queer community. And it does deal, it has a happily ever after. It does have humor because I'm sarcastic and I can't not do that. But it does have trauma, it has domestic violence, it has bullying, it has loss of a partner. And I knew I was taking a risk by writing that book because people who are looking for an escape from reality, people who are looking for just the lighthearted, happily ever after, we have enough tough stuff to deal with, especially over the last 18 months. So just realize that it can be, we're adding to the diversity, but whether or not the people are buying those books is a whole other issue. We also are increasing inclusion and representation of authors and characters that identify as, BIPOC and API, which stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, and or Asian American and Pacific Islanders. So, and also getting more trans characters and authors represented as well. The other thing I'll mention here is that within the mainstream, we're seeing more and more kind of secondary characters who just kind of happen to be queer. It's not the focus of the story. And so I just, talk about this as normalizing queer characters. It's not necessarily good or bad. It's kind of a case-by-case basis. But again, it comes down to you want to have a well-developed character who's not just a token for diversity. And even if it's a secondary character, it still should be well thought out. Let me check here. There's a few questions. Okay. Cool. All right. So this is kind of interesting. So Melinda Lowe is kind of this critically acclaimed YA author of queer fiction. And she not only is an author, but she's compiled a lot of data about queer YA novels. And so I wanted to, I'll have a graph from her because I'm a scientist and that's what I do, but here's a pie graph. This is from 2016, but I just wanted to show you with YA, meaning young adult novels. This is looking at gender representation from mainstream publishers. And the blue, that's 43%, is cisgender female character. And the green is a cisgender male main character. And so the overwhelming majority are cisgender characters who identify as gay. And if you look down, I won't go through all of them, but transgender females represent about 5%, transgender males only 3%. And then you get into non-binary and gender fluid characters, and these are main characters. And that just means they're not prescribing to the male, female typical gender binary. And that's only a 1%. So the takeaway here is that while you see YA novels having some interesting representation, it's largely cisgender, gay, female, and male main characters. So there's definitely some work to be done for trans representation, non-binary and gender fluid representation for sure. Getting to the person that asked the question about kind of seeing queer characters with not a happy ending. So GLAAD actually stands for Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Anti-Defamation. Let me make sure I got that right. Yeah. And they have done an annual report for over 20 years. And so in 2016, their annual report kind of put out this pretty shocking revelation, which was that while in general, LGBTQ representation on TV in terms of repeat characters is increasing, that year alone, 25 lesbian and bisexual female identifying characters had died. It included scripted broadcast shows, cable TV, and streaming services just in the 2016 to 2017 year. And this is pretty huge because when you only have a few tens of characters and 25 are killed off, particularly queer women, it's a problem. And so the bury your gays trope was born. And these are my words that, when you kill off one or two characters, that's one thing if they happen to both be queer women. But when it's 25, especially when, I'm not sure what the overall proportion was, but I want to say there was like maybe 40 to 50, but don't quote me on that. It becomes an act of violence toward queer women when it's at that rate. And so here is the CEO and president of GLAAD, her words. So when the most repeated ending for a queer woman is violent death, producers must do better to question the reason for a character's demise and what they are really communicating to the audience. That was Sarah Kate Ellis. So, the point here is you're probably aware of this if you're in the queer community. If you're not in the queer community, definitely be cognizant of this very recent history. Particularly if you choose to kill off a queer character, my advice would be don't do that. And if it is the case that it's important to your story, it might be worth a real kind of honest discussion with yourself as to why you're killing off a queer character. So, and here's one last point about kind of mainstream representation of queer stories. So I will say, the majority of queer writers are not represented by mainstream publishers. So there are a group of, smaller kind of queer focused publishers. And I'll go through a few of them in a minute. And many queer authors are published by them or they're self-published. So some people do traditional publishing with these queer focused publishers and self-publish. Some people just self-publish, and some people like myself just do an independent queer focused publisher. So here's a few of them is Bella Books. Bold Strokes Books does both gay and lesbian fiction. And if you go to Bold Strokes Books, they actually have a cool search feature. So if you're looking for a specific kind of subgenre, whether it's like sports, I don't know, romance or something like that, or action and adventure, it can help you find those pretty quickly. My publisher is Bywater Books, and they have a new imprint, Amble Press, which focuses on people of color and the larger queer community. So not just the women loving women literature that Bywater represents. Excuse me. There's also Sapphire Books. Ilva Publishing is more in the UK. And if you look at this link below on Readsy, that's about 20 different LGBTQ plus publishers. That includes all the ones I just mentioned, but they are out there, but they are more smaller independent presses and things like that. And Melinda Lowe comes to the rescue once again. She was the one who did the pie graph. And just to show, this is not adult queer fiction. This is again, her area of focus is young adult novels, but she was looking at LGBTQ YA books published by mainstream publishers over 13 years, from 2003 to 2016. And she, if you read the kind of caption at the bottom, she identifies the mainstream publishers as the big five, but also, you know, Disney, Scholastic, Houghton Mifflin, and general interest publishers that don't focus just on LGBT books. And what you see is that it went from under 20 in 2003 to almost 80 in 2016. And so the numbers in 2014 were 47, 2015 went up to 54, and then a jump to an all-time high in 2016 of 79. So while things are getting better in terms of mainstream representation, particularly for young adult novels, we're seeing a good amount of growth. I would say there's always room for more, but particularly for tweens and teens who are already dealing with hard issues, particularly in the last 18 months, and then having to deal with gender identity and sexual orientation, and younger than that too, to see this growth is really good. But like I said, you know, we're still far away from where we should be. Okay, so here's some tips, and I guess maybe my personality coming through a little bit, kind of for writing queer characters and storylines, and also, you know, where to go from here. So I've given you kind of like the bird's eye view, like I said. So first of all, you know, don't write a token queer character for diversity points. It might make it through some mainstream publishers, but that's not a good thing. You know, people will notice, and it will not be good for your reputation. So, you know, do your research and educate yourself, write a well-developed character. So how to kind of learn more about queer communities and things like that. One, as writers, we're readers. So, you know, read queer fiction by queer authors. Pay attention to gender expression, character traits, terminology, and things like that. You can look at queer-focused online media. So autostraddle.com is focused on the queer community, and they're really great at putting out book lists and doing reviews and things like that. The Advocate at advocate.com also does some book lists. And of course, there's a lot more. I just put these two in because they also pay attention to books. But HRC and Googling, you know, queer news outlets and things like that. I like watching movies and TV shows featuring queer characters because you also get to see kind of the movement and the interaction, maybe in a way that might be harder to notice in a book. You know, Schitt's Creek, I can't say enough good things about, queer characters aside, but it's incredibly well written. It's hilarious. And if you watch the documentary on Netflix about when Dan and Eugene Levy, you know, put that show together and created it, they talk about the fact that they spent months coming up with the character backstories. So if you look at the pilot episode, the characters there, and the final episode of the final season, the characters are still the same. Yeah, they've gone through character arcs, but they knew who these characters were inside and outside from the get-go. And I respect that a lot. And it's why they've done so well. The other important thing about Schitt's Creek that really sets it aside from almost every other show about the queer community is that it doesn't show violence. It doesn't show discrimination. It is a loving, accepting kind of show for the queer community. And what's interesting is it is in kind of like this small backward town, so you wouldn't necessarily accept complete acceptance. So that's a really beautiful aspect. You know, Gentleman Jack, The L Word, Queer as Folk, Wynonna Earp, these are not extensive, but they're fun and they're interesting, and you can learn a lot from them regarding the queer community. I would also, if you have queer friends, talk to them. Of course, it's not our job to educate, you know, straight people. I will say that while my straight friends don't necessarily ever ask, I think the most important thing I bring to the table is telling them more than they'll ever want to know about lesbianism and lesbian relationships. And, you know, they'll never be the same again because of that, for better or worse. And then also looking at YouTube or podcasts, you know, you can Google topics. There are people who, you know, are good representatives of different gender identities and gender expression, but make sure you're listening to the right people and vet your sources. Okay, so last kind of tip here, if you've actually written something involving a queer character, there's sensitivity and beta readers. So beta readers are individuals who read unpublished manuscripts. They're not necessarily looking for something specific other than, does it flow? Do the characters make sense? Is there chemistry? Things like that. Sensitivity readers are a subset of beta readers. And so they're looking specifically at issues related to a particular culture, stereotypes, representation issues, things like that. So for example, someone could hire me as a sensitivity reader for, a lesbian character, for example. And one thing that's different about sensitivity readers and beta readers is that sensitivity readers typically do receive payment. Beta readers, you might give them a free copy of your book. Those aren't hard and fast rules, but you're seeing more and more that sensitivity readers are getting paid for that expertise, and as they should. So how do you find sensitivity and or beta readers? You can ask people, make sure they know what they're doing and things like that. And can, especially if it's a sensitivity reader, that they are part of the culture you're asking them to look over. You can post on social media depending on the size of your platform, but you might get way more responses than you want and or ever need. And then there's some reader writer groups on Facebook. And there also are sensitivity reader databases online. So you can Google and look at that. Okay. All right, so some resources and upcoming events. Let's see. All right, so if you're interested in kind of reaching more resources, if you're part of the queer community and looking for more support, there's two organizations I would really recommend. One is Lambda Literary, that supports queer fiction, generally speaking. I think their Lammy Awards are tonight, actually. And so if you look at the Lammy Award finalists and winners, so the books for that year, those are good recommendations of books to look into depending on the genre you're interested in. They also have a writer's retreat for emerging LGBTQ voices. So that might be something you want to look into. An organization I'm really involved in is the Golden Crown Literary Society, or GCLS. And that's focused just on women loving women literature. So they have Goldie Award finalists and winners. And so you can look at those books list for recommendations. They also have a YouTube channel called Golden Crown LS. And this is really helpful because it has author readings, panel discussions, and workshops. So many of the discussions I talked about or referenced in this talk, these are topics we actually discuss as authors. And so you can actually look back and see those. The other thing is they have a writing academy that's a 9-month-long intensive kind of building your craft academy, but you also get partnered with an award-winning writer who mentors you. And so I can't say enough good things about that. You apply and you can get accepted to that. And also GCLS members mention whether they're willing to be beta readers. So if you join GCLS, you can look at member profiles and potentially find a beta reader to look at your stuff. And then I'll mention they're having a virtual conference in July. So I'll mention that in a minute. And there are some literary festivals once the pandemic ends. So there's Saints and Sinners in New Orleans, one of my favorite places in the world. And that is, again, queer fiction. Women's Week is specific to women, and it's not just literature, but that's in Provincetown, Massachusetts. So some upcoming events. This Saturday, if anyone's in Denver, I'll be at the Queer Author Expo. It's at the Center on Colfax from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. So if you're interested in reading more queer fiction, or you are a queer author and wanting to kind of interact with others, I would recommend coming out there in Denver. The other aspect is GCLS's virtual conference, like I said, is in July. I'll be on some panels on July 31st, the last day of the conference, but a lot of education from that. And then the last few things here, we are having Pride here locally. So it is going to be in September. So Colorado West Pride Fest is September 7th through 12th. And some of you might be aware of the Slamming Bricks Poetry Slam event. This is going to be the third year of it, organized by Caleb Verganchik. And it will be on September 11th. And this year, we're going to actually put an anthology together. I'll be the editor of it. And it will be for LGBTQ+, BIPOC and OPI, poets and artists. So if you fit into that group, just hold out. We'll be communicating how to send in submissions very soon. So that will be really awesome. And I was told to mention, so this will be really cool, the next WCWF Writers Night is July 20th. Colleen's story will be talking about why your writing is important. So that sounds like a pretty good talk. Okay. So lastly, there's my email. There's places I am, Facebook, Twitter, not so much on Instagram, and my website. So I'll open it up to answer questions if y'all have any. But again, I know, there might be some very specific questions or things that are sensitive where you don't want to ask in this venue. So you can always email me something later on, and I'm happy to answer.